DJ LeRoy.
NightWatchman, how you doing, buddy?
In a Harlem kind of mood.
Absolutely, I see. Right there in St. Nicholas Park, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Very nice, very nice. Okay. Well, did you have a good week?
Yeah, all things considered. I mean, I think we all need to just take a step and breathe. You know, it's the last rest of the year has been crazy.
Yes.
But certainly November has been a lot.
Absolutely.
Extra.
And so I did learn from an informed source that you weren't at the Million MAGA March. I understand.
I don't even know why do you keep putting my name in the mouth of the same sentence with that? Because I don't know what I did to earn that. I'm not, you know. Are you trying to start some crazy rumors or something like that? I'm not Kanye. I'm not Lil Wayne. No,
Got it.
So,
well, you know what? We got a great show.
Mm-hmm.
Show about the election, about education, about desegregation, about even Brown versus Board of Education. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So as they say, let's get this thing popping. All right.
Let's do that.
First guest is a brother who I met when I was making trips to Democracy Prep with Julian, and he was there, and I got the real cool vibe from him, and he was a guidance counselor there at Democracy Prep. Now he has left that fold, but he continues to be an advisor to young people trying to actually seek and achieve the college experience.
Mm-hmm.
Let's bring out Mr. Justin Jones.
Mm-hmm.
What's up, Justin?
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
Good to be here.
Hey, the second person, she's heard it so many times, I'm tired of even saying it, but she is absolutely responsible for Julian getting, actually enjoying his experience there at Democracy Prep. The person who first gave me the tour of the spot, and also for me to also learn that education wasn't her first start. It was really in the legal profession as a lawyer. She's an esquire herself, and that, of course, is Miss Princess Lyles. Hey, Princess.
Welcome, Princess.
All right. And last but not least, like I said, family has no boundaries, and this, of course, would be none other than the one, the only, Dr. Vernée Butterfield. Bring her out. Hey,
Vernée.
How you doing? Good.
Hi, everyone.
Good.
Good.
So, NightWatchman. That's right. I don't even have to say it again. Yeah, there you go. So I see from actually getting also the background on all you have attended a historical black college. I want to hear from each of you in terms of your experience there. Vernée?
Yeah, so I went to Howard University, and I was at the School of Communications. My master's was in speech language pathology, which was my former / mixed career. I dabble in a little bit of it now in writing as a former speech language pathologist. My experience there was starkly different from my upbringing, meaning where I grew up and where I attended undergrad. Undergrad, I went to Tufts University, and Howard was my first time, besides visiting back home in Bermuda, being around that many Black people at one time in mass concentration. Despite, obviously coming to the city to see my family, right? It was a very new experience for me, but one in which I know when you walk out of the gates of Howard, you can deal with anything that comes your way. It gives you such a sense of a backbone in a very different way that even if you are on a predominantly white campus and you find your affinity group, you will not have the same experience that you would at an HBCU. So,
gotcha. Okay.
That's why we know Kamala's out of there, so we good.
Princess, tell me your experience.
Sure. So I'm a double HBCUer. I went to Spelman College for undergrad, which I absolutely loved. So I left Connecticut and went to Atlanta. And it was a new world. And then after Spelman, I went to Howard Law. And both experiences I wouldn't trade it for the world. I think there's something very, very special I think historically Black colleges are almost like sacred ground. And so there is no place that I would rather have spent my my career in terms of preparing for the world at large after college and after law school.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Justin, if a woman says Spelman, then you have to say
Morehouse.
Go ahead. You got it, baby. Go ahead. Do tell. Do tell.
So yes, I went to Morehouse for undergrad. I studied philosophy, got a Bachelor of Arts. And that actually is what kind of led me into education. I'm currently at Teachers College getting a master's in philosophy and education. So still kind of in the same wheelhouse of study. But as you mentioned earlier, that's kind of how I ended up in the counseling role. And so Morehouse for me was a time where a lot of people poured into me. Princess can probably speak to the AUC and how it is a safe place in the sense that you can go there and truly be yourself. You can, for lack of a better term, mess up and still get back up on your feet and keep moving. And so all those mentors and people I had around me, friend groups and things, really helped me understand that it's about who helps you on this path. And so that kind of led me into education. And so shout out to Morehouse, shout out to HBCUs, shout out to HU.
Gotcha. Well, please do tell. Now, all of you guys have chosen, of course, education. And so we certainly do know under this administration that is still in the White House, under the Department of Education, we had Betsy DeVos. Did you guys at all feel any impact from any of the policies that were being pushed by 45?
I can speak to that.
Go ahead.
So right now I am a director of talent, recruitment, and management at a charter school in New Haven, Connecticut, Booker T. Washington Academy. And in addition to my role of recruiting teachers, I actually provide in-house racial equity work for the staff and do that as a consultant as well in other schools in Connecticut, as well as a hospital in Washington, D.C. And about 2 weeks ago, I should say, or maybe about a week ago, I had to have a conversation with my ED about what my role and my work would look like should the current administration continue and move forward with banning my work. And what that would mean moving forward if people wanted to opt out to avoid a potential lawsuit. Would it impact funding from some of the organizations that I'm working with? So needless to say, I am very excited about our new administration, incoming administration, who I believe will support this work. But I believe Betsy DeVos had no intentions of making sure that work would be continued, in addition to how she was offering support for how we function during the COVID paradigm.
Gotcha. Princess.
I would just say, I was just appalled that they would even say, like, we're going to ban this type of work under, what all has happened over the last few months with racial equality in this country. It was just so surprising that we were even having this conversation. But, I guess we couldn't really be surprised at anything that has happened under the administration. I don't want to step too far, so I'll just say that.
I hear you. Justin, do weigh in.
So similarly, I work at a charter school, working at charter schools, and so anti-racism work is somewhat of a backbone that kind of helps keep charter schools somewhat in line. And so with that executive order, it was very, I think, sobering for a lot of people in the leadership higher ups to recognize that, hey, this is what we do. We're possibly losing funding. So I can't say personally that I was affected on the, onset, but definitely rippling effects around the community and place that I worked for. So.
Gotcha. So we know that certainly Brown versus Board of Education. Ooh, what am I hearing there?
Brown drag race outside.
Yeah, it definitely does. So Brown versus Board of Education spelled the end of school segregation and the real start of desegregation. But we certainly do know that stuff has maybe the high point of desegregation was probably around 1988 or so. And we've seen a continual, I would say, move to school segregation again. You guys are all on the charter school and public school front. What have your observations been? Anyone?
I would say that we've never recovered from Brown versus Board of Ed, in that it displaced both principals and teachers. And our teaching force currently reflects about 80% that of white people. And waiting for that teaching force to look like this call here is going to be like watching grass grow, right? So the notion that Brown versus Board of Ed, served itself as a purpose to desegregate, yes, but it has caused such displacement in our community that our students of color don't have opportunities to see teachers and principals who look like them across the board, right? And it's not just for the benefit of students of color, it is also for the benefit of people who don't look like us, who need to see people who look like us in those roles, right? So I same thing in light of, we're 3/5 of a human. We've never recovered from that either. The same thing with Brown versus Board of Ed.
Yeah. Someone else.
I think that desegregation is such a mammoth issue. I think that there's so much to be said about it. Like, when it happened, when Brown versus Board of Education happened, you had white flight. People have been trying to not uphold that decision since the beginning. And so what we are seeing now is that schools are more segregated than ever. And I think at this point, if I'm honest, I just feel like people have kind of given up and thrown their hands up and saying, like, okay, we're not going to worry about this. What else can we do to make sure that schools are equal? What else can we make sure that Black and brown kids get what they need to have? And we're not going to chase, white people anymore. If we're not going to like beg people to be in class with Black and brown kids. So when you look at urban centers, they are very much, we can look at our own New York City, one of the most segregated school systems in the country, and it continues to be. And last year with Carranza, there was a little bit of an upheaval about what could be done, but I think it ended up being more lip service than what we actually saw happen. And when you look at like what people could actually do, they were basically saying, we will go into the places where parents want to lead these desegregation efforts, and if the community wants it, then we will try to uphold it. But outside of that, we're not going to push it too much. Right. And I think that Carranza spoke with a big stick at first, but I don't know if much actually happened. And that shows like the politics in the back room of like what can actually be done versus what we say can be done.
Right.
Gotcha.
I agree.
Any thoughts, Justin?
I always think about desegregation and Brown versus Board, and Princess already mentioned it, that we're more desegregated than ever. And it kind of gets me to the point where I always end up in this space when I start talking about schools, because, desegregation really has more so to do with housing, right? It has more so to do with where are people allowed to live. Even when you talk about the issues within public schools, right? How are public schools funded? Well, 80% of public school funding comes from property taxes. And so even the fights to get kids into better schools, right? Because no one wants to segregate the other way. No one wants to send, privileged white kids down into the hood or, into the Black centers, right? And to desegregate, it's always this idea of resources. That was the whole Brown versus Board thing, right? That's why it was such a crucial landmark civil case, right? It's the idea that you can have the same access to quality, right? Or at least legally, you should have the same access to quality. And that's really what you're talking about, quality of life, quality of living. And so Brown versus Board, I think, gets caught up in this idea of, are Black children with white children? But for me, it's really, are both groups, or these groups that are under this law, able to access the quality of living that is supposedly guaranteed under, what our Constitution and general legal system says, and that's really where I come down to it. So,
Gotcha. Well, so charter, public.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a real, how should I say, a real difference in terms of how they're structured, and which one is beneficial? Would you say? Have you been exposed to both of those systems? Go ahead, Justin.
How long you got?
All right, we'll touch the top of the iceberg, but go ahead, Justin. Go ahead.
I think I would say, right, all charter schools, right, at least in a general aspect, are public schools, right? And I think if you want to talk about which is better, it's really a case by case basis, right?
Okay.
Because you have parents who are stuck with a school, right? Going back to this idea of property taxes, where the housing and the area is low income, and so the school doesn't get a lot of money. I'm from Georgia. I went to what was called a Title I school, right? And so that means you had to make AYP under the Bush years, adequate yearly progress, in order to keep your funding coming in, right? And so I love my public school. I love my high school experience, right? Don't get me wrong. But there was still this underlying idea that there could be better for you, or that there is better, and that this is what you're stuck with. And so for parents who are given the option of a charter school, well, charter schools have a lot of benefits that regular public schools that are under a Department of Education can't do. So there's less oversight. There's more funding, right? A lot of private funding. There's a lot of leeway in charter schools that, you don't get caught up in the red tape of the DOE public schools. And so it's very hard to say one is objectively better than the other. I think you have a tendency to gauge the goodness or the efficiency of a school by test scores, which I have issues with that. I won't go into that. And so I can go in a lot of ways with this, but basically I just want to say that it's really a case by case basis, and you have to really get into the details of what is happening in your public area to understand, well, why are there charter schools? Is this actually a better fit for my student than what it is for the public? And should I be fighting for something else, right?
Gotcha. Vernée.
I don't even know where to start. I feel when I was about to write my dissertation, I remember my chair saying to me, throw out 4 things that you want to write about. And the first thing I said was the restoration of the charter movement. So how charter schools work together with public schools for the sake of improvement, right? Showing improvement. And she looked at me, never forget, Dr. Norbella Carter, Black woman, love her dearly. She said, do you want to graduate? And I remember looking at her like, what do you mean? She said, that's a longitudinal study. Go and change the world when you finish. Let's find a topic that's feasible for you to get at. And I remember her saying this to me, but thinking in the back of my mind that if we could get back to this notion of bridging that divide between public and charters, because you'll frequently hear the argument that charters steal money from public and all these issues that come to play. They're not unionized, and some of the things that Justin was speaking to, that if we could really get into this notion of why charters exist in the first place, right, then we would show an improvement in our education system as a whole. I'm not saying charters the end all be all, and I'm not saying that all charters operate well. They don't. And don't all have great outcomes. However, if we could get into this mind frame of, are we in the business to educate? And if there's people out there who are doing education well, what are we doing and how can we replicate it?
Gotcha.
And I do think that that's the way we need to go in terms of bridging that divide so that we can really improve the educational system. And if we don't admit that our educational system is failing, then we have no starting place.
That is true. Princess.
No, yeah, I totally agree. I think that, charters were started to be an experiment and possibly bring some practices, I don't want to say best practices, some practices back to the public school space. I think I have come a long way in my thinking since I started with charters about 10 years ago, and saying like it also has to be a give and take. So charter leaders can't think, oh, okay, we're going to bring best practices to public schools. Because public schools have best practices, traditional public schools have best practices to bring to charters too. So I really think it needs to be a give and take, and we do need to really look at bridging the gap. If we look at, New York City, again, charters probably make up just under 10% of the schools that make up the public school that educate 1 million plus students. So how can we work together to make sure that the masses of children are getting excellent education? And I think there's a lot of bridge building that we can do to make sure that happens. So I think we have to dismantle that conversation and stop talking about either this or this, either public, traditional public, or charter public, which is better and why. To saying how can we work together and learn together and make education as best as possible for all students, kind of across the board.
Agreed.
I also think that if you're going to talk about charters, you really have to look a step back and look at who's operating the charter, what is their concept for the education, because charters really do give an opportunity to shape a different type of educational experience from the public school education. And I was a mentor at Eagle Academy when they first started their first location. And that I thought that's just a great example of a group of people coming together with a clear vision for what they wanted to do and executing it and getting results and pushing the envelope to see how can we create a better education for young Black men, and what are the things that we want to instill aside from the educational content. What's the life content we want to create? What's the example we wanted to create? And they did a great example by creating an institution that was run by Black men for young Black men. And so, from that experience, I can see, if you're going to talk about charters, you really have to talk on that case-by-case basis, just as Justin said, just as everyone said. But there's a lot of opportunity in that space to do something, push the envelope in ways that it needs to be pushed, and hopefully bring that back to just the general space, because we're all about the same thing, which is how do we prepare our young people for a world that is rapidly evolving, transforming. Industries are being created and destroyed as we speak. Things are being disrupted. And we want to be able to put them on a track where they have an opportunity for success. And I guess that's really the general idea, regardless of the environment. How do we take that on? How do we take advantage or just address the challenges that, to me, are unimaginable, what young people have to kind of look at going on in the world today. Absolutely.
And you know what? You had said it early in terms of the differences in charters. There are good charters, bad charters. You also wonder, early on, before I actually understood about the whole charter school movement, right? There was a name. I remember when I was out in working for Borough President Schulman back in the day, and there was a woman who was a council member, and she happened to be on the education committee at one point. But then she started a movement of charter schools, and I'm talking about Eva Moskowitz. And we do know that in some circles, rightly or wrongly, she is sometimes vilified. Now, on that note, I mean, what besides what you said, NightWatchman, in terms of the Eagle Academy, why aren't more African American brothers and sisters going into education?
It's underpaid.
Yeah, I was going to say they're
underpaid. John, don't need to elaborate. You are underpaid, right? And so why would there's a couple things. Why would I flock to a profession where if I'm going to be underpaid, I can't make a living, right? And number two, if I've had a negative educational experience, why would I want to go into the field where that's happened for me, right? So there's a myriad of issues as to why that's not attractive. And then we move into the university college setting, admissions is difficult in teacher preparation programs, right? And predominantly white institutions. That's why we have Call Me Mister at Clemson University, where we're attracting and specifically looking at how we attain and retain rather Black male educators, right, who make up 2.7% of the teaching force across the country. Right?
Okay.
So there's a number of issues why that happens, but I would definitely say number one is it's underpaid, right? And so most people who will start out as educators in the classroom will strive to move into leadership, because that's where you will start to make more money.
Well, Princess, I have to say you certainly were not at a slouchy law firm. You were at one of the white shoe law firms, and you then opted to go into education. So, which you, as you know, is not, the pay is not up here. So, what motivated you?
Sure. So simply, I hated working in a law firm. I was practicing corporate and real estate law, and it just wasn't the person that I wanted to be. And so for me, it was easy because after 2.5, 3 years, I knew that this wasn't what I wanted to do, and I needed to kind of recalibrate and think of what I needed to do next. Having said that, I had a lot of explaining to do to my parents. There was a lot of sacrifice. I understand where people are coming from. There's a lot of sacrifice made to make sure that, that I could be in the position that I was in, to be in a law firm. And I read Michelle Obama's book, and I felt like it was me, because at one point her mother said to her, like, "Oh, really? Like, you think you have the privilege to want something else other than this, like, cushy life that you have?" And so it's not an easy decision, especially when people are getting, you're racking up student loan debt. You have so much that is kind of riding on you doing well. And so you are looking for those like high paid positions, the engineers, the law, the doctors. And so, but it is really so important. When I speak to kids, they really want to see people that look like them, teaching them and leading them, and being their school principals. So it's really, really important, but we just have to be able to find the balance.
Gotcha. Justin, your decision. From philosophy to education here.
I mean, again, for me, philosophy is education. Education is just really your lived experience in a lot of ways. I don't do the canonical thing, right? That people want to talk about Kant and, all these other like, we can do that. But for me, largely, it's about how you orient yourself toward, your experiences that you have and the life that you want to live or could live. Right. And so for me, a lot of people will say that philosophy begins in wonder, right? The curiosity around the world. And I've always been curious just about people, lived experiences, and how people make decisions about why they do one thing versus the other. And so I did a lot of mentorship. Even in high school, I was SAD, which was like Students Against Drug Driving. I didn't even have a license. I didn't drive, but I was counseling. I did peer helpers. I did a lot of different things. And then when I got to college, I was a Bonner Scholar. And so I did community service. So technically I was doing 280 hours of community service every academic year. So technically it was a job. So we were based at different sites, and two of my sites happened to be educational in orientation. One was a place called GNET, which was essentially an alternative school for Fulton County students who had social emotional issues, other things that affected them. They couldn't be in the general population, so they went to this alternative school. I counseled there for a little bit so that they could move back into the general pop. And then I also worked at a high school, which is actually Martin Luther King's high school, Booker T. Washington, right over in Mine City. And so I was working with the students there with like SAT and all that. And so I've just always been in a place where I want to sit and listen and help someone else figure out, because for me at root, like, that's what helped me get to where I was, right? Someone sat and listened to me and helped me figure out my life. And so philosophy and education for me are just hand in hand. And it's really just living your life and every day helping someone else figure out what they're going to do in that moment, so.
Okay. Princess, I had a question for you. Tell me about Educators for Excellence. Do tell.
Oh, sure. So before I came back to Democracy Prep, I was the managing director of outreach at Educators for Excellence, and that organization represents teachers, basically from different regions throughout the country. So to the New York region, so we worked with New York public school teachers, which was a really interesting transition for me because I had come from charters.
Yep.
And then I went to working with teachers that were mostly public school teachers, traditional public school teachers, and then came back to Democracy Prep. It was a really great experience.
Nice.
To work with traditional public school teachers. And again, and that's where I come from in terms of saying, like, I think there are so many misnomers kind of on both sides of the aisle when you think about charter and when you think about traditional. So I think that was a really great eye-opening experience for me to really meet some teachers that wanted to be advocates. I am very, very friendly with, a number of the teachers that we worked with and throughout that experience. And it really helped to give me a broader perspective in terms of my education experience.
Gotcha. So also, and I'm going to further that because knowing that you are one of the few mothers on this show. Do tell, in terms of your two daughters, what do you see? Do you see public, private, charter?
That's a good question. I think it depends on where you are in the life cycle of your child's education. I think you have to look at your child and see what's going to be right for them. And make the decision based on the child when you can. I think that the major thing that I stand for is making sure that parents have the right to have a choice. And so whether that is the school up the block or the charter around the corner or 5 miles away or a private school, I think is, or again, New York City or GNC, which goes into a whole nother thing. And when you talk about segregation and desegregation, it's kind of all in that together, and you can get into why are we testing kindergartners, and at what point is it the right time to start to divvy up students in that way. But I think I'll see. But I will, and a lot of what I do is advocate for parents and parent choice. And so I definitely want to make sure I leave all options on the table and just choose the one that's going to be, best for my individual child. And I have two.
That's right.
One might be right for one child and something else might be right for another.
Absolutely. And Justin, if you stay in Harlem, what you going to do? You start a family here in Harlem.
I mean, for me in education, honestly, I've always, you didn't mention it, but I've always thought about homeschool. I mean,
okay.
I consider myself fairly well read. I can, to teach another, and I've taught. I've been in education for was my 5th year now, and so homeschooling is definitely an option. But for me, I went to a public school. I never went to a private school until I went to college, went to Morehouse. And so I came from around the way of sorts. And so for me, it's just there's things that you will get in a public school that you will not get at a private school. And it's how you orient yourself toward those experiences. Because I don't think I would have come out the same person that I am today had I gone to a private school or an institution. Not to say that my parents didn't try and get me around there.
Absolutely. So and I'm thinking about the experience there. Let's say I got Wilton, I got New Haven, I got Danbury.
Yeah.
I don't even know the names of those places.
I
don't know what those are.
So Wilton is in Fairfield County near Greenwich, Stamford, lower Fairfield County, so about an hour from New York City, hour and some change. Danbury is about, it's the town up from where my parents live, and it's still in Fairfield County, but it's more diverse. Huge Brazilian population. Danbury, okay. and Black as well. I grew up in Wilton and went to Wilton Public Schools, and I was one of the only Black girls for most of the time that I was there. Right? I did not have a Black teacher until I got to Tufts University, and even then I could still count them on my hands. Obviously, it wasn't until I got to Howard that I was like, everybody Black, this is great. But and then the same experience at Texas A&M where I did my PhD, and could still count on my hands, the professors who looked like me. But I'm in the process of adopting, and so
Oh,
yeah,
I did.
you know that?
Right here on Soul Lounge. We learned. Okay.
Thank you. So, been thinking about, daycare and schools, and like Justin said as well, I'm a byproduct of the public school system, despite being, one of the only ones in the system at the time in the town. But feel confident that if in fact I have to replicate that given where I live, that my child will know who they are and what they are, right?
If they come into our family, they're gonna know.
They don't know, right? They don't know, right? Exactly. But I think it's that fine line where we were talking about before, this notion of redlining, right? And that I live in a town where my parents still reside, that the school system is great, right? By virtue of the zip code and by virtue of the property taxes. And so do you benefit from a quality education? Yes, I can look back to my educational experience. But what happens if you don't have parents or families who remind you who you are? Right? And that's the key, that wherever you decide to put your children in school, what are you or how are you going to supplement to make sure that they know who they are? Because the system's always going to remind you, whether you're in all Black or whether you're in all white or whether you are in a diverse environment, right?
Right. So, and it's funny that you mentioned that because when I thought about Amy Coney Barrett, and she basically said, she has the two Black children from Haiti. But she also said that she doesn't believe that there's any systemic racism.
Yeah,
and I said,
can I be real? I'm just going to be as transparent.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Trouble. I believe that's for show. I think it speaks to the freedom in which people can adopt children without recognizing how in touch they need to be with their own racial identity.
Yeah.
I can say, becoming a licensed adoptive parent, we have to go through a huge process. And I started in April of 2019, and here we are, November of 2020. And when I started asking questions in terms of, we know how many kids are in the foster system, and it's predominantly kids who are Black and brown. How are you helping parents understand what that means when they're bringing home children who don't look like them? And the response that I got was their hair. We help them with hair care. Right? Now, that's important, because I don't need to walk around with one poof on the head and a braid on the other. However, right, we need to be able to help people understand the cultural identity of the children that they will receive in their home, and in their racial identity, and how do you preserve that? But it first requires a lens of introspection that you need to have in order to do so. So again, speaking to the educational system, don't look for that to happen for your child. We have not hired a crop of teachers who are all capable of that. And I think that speaking to the work that I'm doing, trying to do this on a broader scale, is what's going to help us get
so that is absolutely something that I found very refreshing about, my experience at Democracy Prep, and that they wanted me to be involved. They wanted the parent to be involved in the educational process. And there was really no getting around that. We were going to be involved, regardless of whether you wanted us or not. But I do think that there is, as you said, Vernée, a certain mentality that the school system is supposed to do everything. Right. It's supposed to be the babysitter. It's supposed to teach them morals, teach them everything. Yeah. What say you, Justin, when you hear a parent approaching it like that? I drop off my child here, and you're supposed to run the gamut, take care of them, everything.
I mean, there are some circles and some people that I know that will call, school a glorified daycare, in the ways that. But again, for me, I always ask, why have schools been placed in this space where all the burdens fall on the educator to transmit everything for, the coming generation, right? Schools used to be a place where you literally went to learn and explore different subject areas, different things like that. But now it's a place that we are, I have my kids. Are we going to teach financial literacy? Are we going to, teach all these different, what they call life skills? That's actually what I taught at DP. I had to teach life skills to ninth graders, right? Which is a lot of things was executive functioning, right? How to make emails, a lot of different things like that.
Wow.
Which, again, I'm indifferent to the idea that schools are responsible for some of these things, because if they are, then, give them the resources, actually make them work toward that end. But see, we don't have schools that are made toward that end. And then they're also given the burden of saying you also need to do these things when you can't even do the singular thing that you were originally created to do, right? And it gets back to this again, this idea for me again of the society that our schools are in, right? And the way that they are made. And so someone, I think earlier in this talk, said schools are, failing and not working. But for me, the way I see it, schools are working pretty well. The institutions and society, there are plenty of theorists who say that, our public education system sets people up for what their life outcomes will be largely. And so if you go to a public school, generally speaking, you're not supposed to go past a certain threshold of like accomplishment and achievement versus if you're a private school. And it even comes down to how you think about, what's happening at public schools versus private schools. I've been to private schools where kids are getting up, walking around, they can leave, they can go do whatever they want to do, take personal internships, like all kind of stuff. It was wild. This private school, people are paying upwards of $30,000 a year just for the kids to have this experience versus, the public school I'm working at, I got to tell kids, get in line, do this, do that, and the third, sit down. Like some of the horror stories that I've heard about charter schools and the militancy and how their discipline systems, which it's talked about. It's very well known conversation at this point, but it's just the way schools are structured literally lead to some of the outcomes that we see. And so I think that if we want schools to take on this extra burden of providing everything, then there are some other things that need to shift before that can actually become a thing, at least for me.
Gotcha.
Let's talk about the resource gap that we saw as a result of COVID-19 between private schools and public schools.
Yeah, the inequities ring true. So that was me who said, that public schools are failing our students. I think public schools are working for some, definitely not for all. And I would say that it has yards of improvement to go for Black and brown children, right? And what we've seen with COVID has really exacerbated the inequities that were already there in education and healthcare. And so the question is, who are we going to wait for? Who's our savior, right? And so because COVID's here to stay, right? We're still dealing with in our own community, and I think we have to take some sense of ownership too. But we also have to understand the systemic racism that puts us in this particular paradigm. In that we have parents who say, if I don't go to work, I'm going to lose my job, and I don't have anybody else to leave my kid with in order to attend remote learning, right? So what am I going to do? And if I lose my child and my child just logs on in the morning and then doesn't show their face on the camera for the rest of the day just to say that they were present, are they really learning, right?
Wow.
Or if I'm going to leave my child with a grandparent or a relative that says, I've never turned on a computer, let alone send an email, or I don't even know what Zoom is. I have a prepaid telephone, right? We have parents who leave their kids who can afford a nanny, but let's say the nanny doesn't speak English, but you're expecting them to work with the child to deliver these outcomes for their education, right? There's so many inequities that we are speaking to that COVID has, beyond a shadow of a doubt, exacerbated for our kids. In the Austin Independent School District in Texas, a bus literally went around in neighborhoods and sat from 8 to 2 with modems and internet equipment in order for children to access the internet to do their schoolwork from 8 to 2 every day, right? So again, if we're going to sit here and wait for the savior, we need to be cracking on to these corporations that can help fund this, because sitting there waiting for Superman is not going to happen, right? So we need to be really putting the pressure on our, as you guys said in your last Soul Lounge call podcast, our councilmen, our congresspeople to help with this in order to offset that cost, right? We need to be appealing as educators to do so, and instead of waiting for the solution to come to us.
Gotcha. Princess.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. One thing that we need to lean on the federal government for is to make sure internet access is available for all Americans, just point blank. And this shows the reason why. And what I say is like, yes, at some point, hopefully in the near future, there will be a vaccine for COVID, and like we will go back to as much a state of normalcy as we can. But there's going to be something else. So I just feel like the way the world is moving, when COVID passes, something else will happen that we will be in this state again. So how are we going to prepare better next time around so that we can get through this? Because this is just the way the world is going. And I'll tell you, and I'm not talking about our school. I think we did well in terms of like gearing up and getting kids ready. But this is, even democracy prep, when you look across our 5 different regions, that's a little over 7,000 students, but there are millions of students that can access. And I know, and I don't want to call out any specific place, but, places in middle America where like they're still, trying to make sure that the kids have, internet access to make sure that they're logging on appropriately.
Yeah.
The gaps that are going to happen as a result of COVID are real. How are we thinking about how we're going to address these gaps? And, they say when some catch a flu, the black and brown catch the bigger
pneumonia.
virus.
That's right. That's right.
So what are we going to do to make sure we are closing a gap that already existed with black and brown kids to make sure that they are ready to continue to move forward? I'm very very scared about like what that looks like for kids as we move forward. Yeah.
Gotcha. Justin.
The resource gap, man. That's again, you get into the politics of it all, right? You talk about that funding scheme. I think some schools fared better during this. I know my school in particular had a pretty good donorship. Like they were able to get those modems out, get that internet access out. But half of the country does not have internet access, and then you want us all to be on Zooms and social distance and teachers. Even think about older teachers in some of the public schools. I think about the lack of the younger staff. Right, there's been a drainage in teacher hiring, and so like you have older staff members who aren't as technically savvy trying to deal with these things, and so the resource gap is there. It's just been exacerbated, as you said, but again, it gets back to the larger conversation is, well, how were these things funded in the first place? Where was the money originally coming from? Where was it going in the first place? Trump screwed everything because he had a whole playbook that he just threw out the window, so that's his loss. And it's definitely, I think, just allowed us to see more clearly, because it's not like people hadn't talked about these things, these issues in our, resource fundings and all that, but it's just more clearly that these are some very serious things that have to be addressed at some point. Because I'm from Georgia, and so, there are a lot of issues in rural education that don't even get talked about. We tend to just kind of center things around urban education, cities. And so that conversation discourse kind of annoys me at times, just because I know, you got one major high school serving a couple 1,000 students in some of these areas of the South. And so it's just we really have to figure out what funding looks like. And again, and I tell people all the time, federal funding is a dime, like a very small drop in the bucket for public education funding. And so that's not where the fight is. If you really want to talk about money, it's really your state and your local legislatures that you have to corral to really fix how funding is allocated to these public institutions. And so it can't be that every 4 years get out and vote, because the president really doesn't have anything to do about your public education system outside of dangling money to states to say, hey, if you do this, we'll give you some federal funding. And so people, I think, have a misdirection in terms of who they need to address in terms of fixing things in their communities, especially when it comes to funding and resources for public institutions.
Gotcha.
But I want to also just say real quick, too, that we also can't ignore the fact that this is also the response to this, and the inequities are deeply entrenched and rooted in racism, right? that post 9/11, within 72 hours, we have now traveled in an entirely different way since 2001 in that particular time frame, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about within 72 hours, we were able to completely shift around the globe how we traveled, what response we could give to the inequities in education. And the inequities in education, as Justin just pointed out, point to both urban and rural areas. And if rural white children still outperform Black children, we know this to be rooted deeply in racism, right? If the Senate could push through Amy Barnett within the matter of weeks to be confirmed in the Supreme Court, the response to these inequities could be solved and addressed in a much different way. But the reason why that's not happening is because there is not an admission to the fact that this is deeply rooted in racism.
Okay. Night Watchman, how we doing there?
We're doing good.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I mean, one of the things people don't know that you also come from a public school background up there in White Plains. Could you do tell me about your experience, Night Watchman? How did you prepare for your great career here?
Well, first of all, hold on. I'm hearing an echo.
Uh-oh.
Okay. So I went to a public high school in Westchester in the 60s and 70s. So it's not as relevant as things are now.
You're not a spring chicken? You're not a spring chicken, Night Watchman?
Never copped to that. But I got a great education, great public school education. It allowed me to go to an Ivy League school. I took AP classes. I was able to excel there. And I was never at risk. So that's really what it is. It's like, can you have an education where you're not at risk? And there's a lot of factors besides the school that impact that.
Okay. You know what I want to ask, and this also gets back to you also Justin, in terms of anti-racist teaching and learning. I did see that there had been a move to actually have 1619 as part of the curriculum in elementary school. And I did see a movement, I think it was Senator Cotton. Cotton, who basically said that, no, he was totally against that we need to instead have, and I think the president is pushing it, the 1776 curriculum. So please, somebody tell me, what is the harm in terms of telling the story of our arrival here, which is American history, and what that would do?
I think largely it's, just what do you want to believe about your country? What do you want to believe about yourself? What do you believe about the people that you come from? And I think that's really where a lot of anxiety comes around, because let's get it. Public schools are, indoctrinating systems, right? You're supposed to be a patriot when you're coming out of these schools. Be happy you got public education. Think about it, right? This doesn't happen anywhere else. How can you hate America? How can you even talk about the sins of America? No, right? So you look at, education and history is, I think, a very profound thing that people should study. And right, the arguments about, well, what do we revere as our historical origin? Is important. And so they understand that on the right. They understand what that fight means. They understand what it means to start, again, changing what is actually indoctrinating in the public sphere. And so that's why they're fighting against it. It's ridiculous. I, however, think they're mistaken, is that teaching the 1619 project, I think, won't create people who are anti-racist. I think that's foolish. Personally, I think it's, again, my Southern orientation. I'm not too caught up in interpersonal racism. Like, I don't really care if you don't like me because I'm a Black person. That has nothing to do with me. It really comes, Stokely Carmichael said it best, right? If a white man hates me, that's his problem. Now, if he has the power to do something about that hate that he has, well, then that's my problem. And so that's really start talking about systems and access and all that. Like, I care less about if you don't like someone because of how they look or where they're from. It's definitely not the way you should be, but those are matters of the heart versus matters of like our general public orientation and how we conduct ourselves in the public sphere and what we have access to and what we are allowed to do, right? And so that's really where it comes down to me. So I mean, definitely teach 1619, teach that history. I'm tired of the whole, we're the greatest country on earth shit, because really when you look at it, our country has fallen far, 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 far from where it used to be as terms of world power. I mean, Forbes put out an article, I think about a year ago, a third of this country exists in what we would consider a third world or a developing country conditions and situations. So think about that. The United States of America, a third of this country exists in what we consider third world conditions. And so that really takes away from the glitz and glam of the big bad America that we really talk about. But you don't get that narrative. You don't get the narrative that we're slowly degrading our way of life, et cetera. And so the fight for what we teach children is important, especially the history of what it is, because that's what people carry into the future, right? And how they look back and say that we were this and this is why we're this now. I mean, look at Germany, right? Germany teaches about the Holocaust, but they teach it in such a way as that we wore that happened, yes, but we'll never do that again, and we won't ever be that again. And so that's why we're where we are today. America has yet to reckon with what it's done on this. So that's really what you're looking at. People just want to stay with that fairy tale of, we came over here, fought for our independence, and we're going to keep doing that. And so that's generally where you're looking at the fight. It's just how do you want to think about yourself?
Yeah.
Vernée.
Yeah. So I'm trained in a protocol called Courageous Conversations About Race, developed by Glenn Singleton. There's a lot of feedback on that.
Bob, you got any feedback? Put you on mute. See what happens.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
That's okay. Yeah, it was developed by Glenn Singleton about 25 years ago. And it really does offer what I've sort of likened it to in this sort of Eurocentric systematic way of approaching the conversation with race and racism, because there's a distinction between the two. But what I've been able to do is incorporate the way that I engage in the conversation by doing different activities and challenges with the leadership and staff of the schools and the hospital that I consult in, to get people to move the needle in the conversation, right? I culminate sometimes with, for example, last week I had challenged the group of 55 people to read a chapter on white silence, and really trying to just break the silence in the session itself, right? To get recognize where they were in that conversation. Because if we sit and, as I said earlier, and wait for the teaching demographics to match that of our student demographics, it'll be like watching grass grow. So we've got to work with the crop of teachers that we have in order to make sure we're best serving our Black and brown children. And in this conversation, I showed a video. You can look it up online. It's a CBS video, a panel of 3 Black people, a Black woman and 2 Black men, talking about white silence on social media. And this one Black woman starts talking about her, and she looks at her infant son and she's crying and saying, I look at him as a smiley, happy baby. And how is it that some people see him as a criminal? And they go through a series of their response to white silence on social media. Now, whatever your social media presence is, take yourself out of that, but thinking about the context of white silence in general. And somebody in the group said, I feel attacked and I feel belittled in response to this video, which is the response we get. That's the fragility, right? And let me just preface this by saying I don't think Robin DiAngelo is the end all be all, but I think that she's palatable.
I think so too. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Black scholars have been doing this for donkey years, as we say in Bermuda. So the scholarship is not new, right? But I can get in better because it's coming from a white woman. And
yes.
So this woman, reacted in such a way that met with, defensiveness. At the end, there was a question about how can you make sense of what the author talks about in terms of race being outside of personality and being an introverted person. And the reason why I don't speak up, or the reason why I don't say anything about racism, is because I just don't speak in groups, and that's just my personality. And this other woman said, I recognize that as a white woman, I feel like I don't have a racist bone in my body. But I need to show support of people who don't look like me. And it means that I need to use my voice and push myself out of my comfort zone to do so. So I don't think it was a question of, do you like me as a Black person? But what are you going to do in the face of injustice, right?
That's good.
We're going to push people to do so within our educational realm so that we can have better outcomes for our Black and brown students, because these people are still responsible for our folks. We've got to make some changes within that educational realm in order for that to happen. I think the movement can come in the work, but it just takes time.
Excellent. Princess. And I see Bob. So we'll get some closing remarks. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Princess, take us home, as they say.
Yeah, no, I have nothing to add. That was amazing. by Justin and Vernée. I would just say, like, at this point, like, anti-racism training is an absolute necessity for educators. Now, it would be great for the general population, but educators who are going to be in front of kids, it's absolute necessity. And like, we can't have the conversation anymore. It just needs to happen. If you are responsible for kids, you need to be able to teach every kid that sits in front of you. And everyone needs to be able to examine their implicit bias, because everyone has it. This notion of like, I don't see race and I'm colorblind and all this, it's just not true. And so we just need to stop saying it. And so, I don't necessarily care about people who are outside of the education realm, but if you're an educator,
I bet you see my color, you thought I robbed something from you.
Justin, closing remarks.
I'm not really good with closing remarks. I think the conversation today was definitely good for me. Good. I think it's just always something for me to reflect on. And just I guess the main thing I always want to get out is just like, your education is something that you have to take ownership for, and it also can't be something that is solely tied around an institution like public schools. And so people should begin to really rethink, or reimagine, rather is a better term, what their education means to them and what it's for, and what it means to actually be educated, and not conferred a degree. And so I think those are just larger conversations that I would like people to have about, their education and their educational experience. And public schools are great. They need our support. We can't default to charter schools because they seem to be the solution. There's a reason why there are charter schools and why public schools aren't doing well. And so, find those reasons, attack those reasons, and we'll hopefully push for a better outcome for Black and brown kids.
Excellent.
So I get you're better with closing remarks than you thought we were.
Exactly. Night Watchman, this has been a great panel, man.
Absolutely.
Sheesh. Who knew? I knew. That's why I booked him. All right. So, no, I definitely want to thank you all. Justin Jones, Princess Lyles, Vernée Butterfield. Thank you for coming on Soul Lounge. This has really meant a lot. And I know, Justin, when you first got the call from me, you say, what? I haven't heard from this brother since his son left. But thank you, my brother, for coming on. And Princess, you know how I feel about you and Ernie. So, yes.
Thank you so much.
And who was that one in the background?
Yeah, that's a 2-year-old.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah.
That's it.
Hi.
Hey. And Doc?
Yes.
Thank you. Love you. You know that, right?
Yeah, of course. Love you too.
And you know that this was prompted because she saw this talk back that I had for some brothers who were graduates of Stuyvesant, class of 74. And she said, where the sisters at? What the hell? So, okay. Thank you there. Night Watchman, go ahead.
Soul Lounge Primetime, 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
That's right. Please check us out. How do you say they're going to check us out? Facebook
and YouTube.
That's it.